All right, let's talk about egoism, pleasure, and indifference. So, we're going to start by talking about Stoicism. This chapter has three philosophies, and Stoicism is the only one that has any present day following, but we are going to talk about them for historical purposes. This dominated Roman thinking from the death of Alexander the Great until Christianity came around and replaced it. It's been refined and developed from its initiation by Zeno in the 3rd century BC, who lectured from a Stoa, which is where the word Stoicism comes from. In order to really understand how this develops, we need a little bit of understanding about Greek history. So Philip, Alexander the Great's father, placed Greece under Macedonian rule, and this ended the era where Greece was ruled by city-states. Alexander the Great extended the Macedonian Empire and began the transition to an empire, and this is referred to as the Hellenistic period. During this period, Greek culture, civilization, and language are being dispersed throughout the Mediterranean, and Greek philosophy becomes widely available. So philosophers then begin to see themselves as part of a single enterprise as opposed to representing the individual city-states. As a result, Plato and Aristotle's work becomes obsolete. So how does virtue apply in the New Age? So we see new social structure rising, new religions arising, and some turn to philosophy. So the Stoics are living in this crumbling world and they begin offering advice. And their basic principle is that you should be indifferent to external differences. Whatever's happening around you, you should be indifferent to that. It's assumed that good or evil depends upon the self. And although others have power over events that may affect you, you can be indifferent to those events. Others cannot exercise a power over you. So virtue resides in the will then, and only the will is good or bad. If one has a good will, achieved by remaining indifferent to external events cannot destroy your character. You will be a free person, independent of the world. For Stoics, virtue consists of learning to accept whatever happens. They often urge people to compel or force their will to conform to events and to try not to force events to conform to their will. Since we have limited knowledge, we should follow the guidance of our own nature. And if things turn out other than we expected, we should just accept that. So ethics of Stoicism need to be understood in the context of their belief in predestination. Predestination is the idea that everything in the world that's happening has already been preconceived, and it's happening according to a divine plan. Nothing happens by chance. Therefore, whatever happened had a rational explanation and was for the best. So, death should not be considered bad because it's predestined by God. The aim then is to achieve a state of being where you're not susceptible to passion or emotion. It really places the onus for becoming good or bad directly upon the individual. So, in this Stoic philosophy, there's a belief and commitment to serving the public. And that's what distinguishes Stoicism from hedonism. The goal here is a life of rationality and developing oneself so you remain invulnerable to passion and emotions. And the person who can live this life is a sage. This is a pretty pessimistic philosophy, but the strength of it is in that it teaches, quote, how to bear with dignity those events which truly are beyond our control. Hedonism. This is the idea that pleasure is the sole good. And the foremost proponent of this is Epicurus. So we often use the word epicure or Epicurean, and this refers to enjoyment derived from exotic and carefully prepared food and wine. Epicurus advocated that we live moderately but pleasurably. So, Epicurus and hedonists also appreciated that the pursuit of pleasure could result in pain. So while enjoying food and wine may be pleasurable, if you drink to excess, that's going to be fairly painful. So the proper way to live is to live pleasantly and at the same time not suffer those undesirable effects. So by pleasure, Epicurus means the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the soul. So the aim here is a healthy body and tranquil mind. Tranquility, therefore, is attained by philosophical understanding and practical wisdom. So there's two forms of hedonism, psychological and ethical. Psychological hedonism says that people should pursue pleasure and only pleasure. All your activities should be directed towards achieving pleasure and avoiding pain, and every action is motivated by a search for pleasure. Ethical hedonism says not only do people seek pleasure, but they also ought to seek pleasure because pleasure alone is good. and the pursuit of pleasure is normative. Well, in both forms, both forms can be criticized because they attempt to provide a single explanation for every behavior. The question of how one ought to live is answered by the idea that the good life is a life of pleasure. Well, let's think about this. Smoking cocaine also provides pleasure, but it also produces severe adverse effects. In practice, it seems pretty difficult to separate pleasure from pain in the way that's advocated in this philosophy. It also seems to violate our common sense views about how we ought to act. So we all have obligations we have to fulfill, things we have to do every day that don't necessarily give us pleasure. Ethical egoism, typically an egoist is self-centered, inconsiderate, okay? And it involves putting your own well-being above that of others. So ethical egoism says, right actions are those which promote your own self-interest. Now, this is an interesting philosophy because it's pretty much in contrast to any form of morality we've talked about. And some would say it's not really moral theory at all. Psychological egoism is how people actually behave. And so all of us are egoists in the sense that our actions are motivated by our own best interests, even when we think about altruistic things we do. So, you might do volunteer work, and even if the volunteer work isn't necessarily pleasurable, the way you feel about doing that could be pleasurable. Or maybe you're volunteering and that's to help atone for some bad behavior. So those are things that are, both of those are things motivated by our own self-interest. We will never find someone's real motivations until we uncover their egoistical motivation. Hobbes said that even charity, someone takes pleasure in demonstrating their power, and pity reminds us the same thing might happen to us. So in that regard, it kind of appeals to cynical nature. And so surely altruism done to help others that also feels good is better than no altruism at all. And it's also impossible to prove this theory because we can only prove that all motives could be selfish, not that they all are. Ethical egoism is promoting your own greatest good to act in accordance with reason and morality. So we have no duty other than to do what is best for us. It doesn't require us to avoid actions that could benefit others. If everyone looks after their own interests, it's likely that everyone will be better off. If we want to do the best for others, we should not act altruistically because we're not completely aware of their needs. And looking out for others then intrudes into their privacy. Giving charity degrades them and robs them of dignity. Ayn Rand proposes that ethical egoism is the only philosophy that respects the integrity of human life. So philosophers have rejected ethical egoism, and it's been returned to again and again. And there's three typical arguments that reject this. It doesn't really help resolve conflicts, right? It might exacerbate them. It's logically inconsistent, and it's unacceptably arbitrary in the same way that racism is arbitrary. We're dividing people into groups where the interests of one group are considered to count more than the interests of another group. So let's talk about applying ethical egoism. Harry's a CO at Grimm Correctional Center. He has a reputation among his coworkers for being very strict with inmates and always being ready to issue a violation. One of the inmates he has charge over on his wing is George, a career criminal and experienced prisoner. George and Harry don't like each other, and George often tries to challenge Harry's authority by breaking prison rules or threatening to break them. And in the past, Harry has reacted to this by issuing many citations for rule violations and having George dealt with through the disciplinary process. Harry's now tired of this, right? And he's decided to show him who really is boss. And he decides that he'll use informal methods to punish George and reinforce his own authority over him. One Friday, Harry inspects George's cell and finds that George has 2 more pictures in his cell than is permitted by rules. Harry considers whether or not he should seize on this violation to use informal means to impose his will on George, or should he follow proper prison procedures. He knows prison officers can use informal ways of controlling prisoners, even though the rules don't really allow for this. So you could not tell an inmate about a scheduled visitor, withhold toilet paper, etc. He decides to think about how he could do this with George, and in his mind, he comes up with a plan. So instead of issuing a disciplinary report for the extra pictures, Harry won't unlock his cell the next morning during the daily prison routine and will secretly place a keep lock tag on George's cell door. The tag will indicate to other COs that George is to remain locked in a cell and will suggest a formal order has been given. This also means George remains locked into a cell until he can get someone's attention and complain. And the deputy superintendent will not be on duty till Monday. So should he act formally or informally? Well, we're going to act according to ethical egoism. What act would most benefit me? How will my own self-interest be promoted? The most ethical action then is the one that is best for him. Okay. And so for Harry, in this case, it's going to be to finally have some control over George. Will others benefit from this? Ethical egoism doesn't ask us to actually do that. So that wraps up ethical egoism.